Hello, welcome to another edition of MetaLogic's Quick Takes. My name is Theo Lazaridis. I am a senior support representative focusing on the content matrix and storage point side. Today we'll be having a session on the minimum permissions required for SharePoint migrations. We will be focusing on the SharePoint edition of content matrix. And I would say out of all the areas that give us the most challenges, permissions would be at the very top. A significant number of our cases that get opened for problems migrating or using the application in general involves permissions. And the reason for that is there's a number of permission areas along the way that need to be set correctly. That starts from your operating system, right to your SQL Server, to your application, your content matrix application, to whatever permissions you have in various areas of SharePoint, whether it's the farm level, web app level, site collection level. And permissions can behave differently based on what you're trying to migrate. For example, workflows, taxonomy is a very big one. Specific permissions need to be set on taxonomy right at the service application level, and that also includes things like My Sites. So with that in mind, let's start from the very beginning. So you download your application. You have here the content matrix offline setup. We do recommend the offline setup from our website. It tends to go a lot smoother and also give less permissions issues, local permissions issues. So right off, you need to be installed. You need to be logged into your local Windows machine as a local administrator to install this. And even with those permissions set, you need to still run this application. This installer runs as an administrator, and this is because many assemblies and whatnot get installed, and they don't get installed correctly if you don't run it as an administrator. I don't know why this is taking so long to come up, but this applies both if you're installing the console, MetaLogic's Content Matrix SharePoint Edition console, or the WSPs, the farm solutions, which include things like the organizer. Oh, okay, here we go. So, yeah, whether you're installing either of these two, you need to run as administrator. The other thing we need to keep in mind is once the application is installed, and this particularly applies to later versions of Content Matrix, I would say 7.2, I don't remember the exact minor version, but 7.2 and higher, I would say, requires that we actually go into here, into the Windows folder, the C Program Files 86, MetaLogic's Content Matrix Consoles, and the SharePoint Edition folder, and that we actually go to the exe here, the actual Content Matrix console, right-click on it, Properties, Compatibility tab, and at the bottom, make sure that this option to run the program as administrator is selected. If it is not selected, again, certain assemblies don't get loaded, even if you've installed as administrator and logged in as administrator, and you can have things like as soon as the application pops up, you see a licensing error, or you see errors mentioning permission problems accessing certain folders, or failing to load your job history file. That's another example of a permissions problem. So that's just installing the application. Those of you who have used Content Matrix before know that there's a number of connectivity options that we have, different adapters you can use, and we'll go through them briefly because each one has their own unique permission requirements. First one is the SharePoint database connection. Connect to SharePoint database. This is probably the least. This is definitely the least restrictive out of all the connection types. It connects. It bypasses the SharePoint API. It connects directly to the SQL Server database, and typically only the read permission is required for the source. And you can only use this on the source because it's a read-only connection. You can't migrate content to it. But it requires a read connection read permission levels to connect to it. We have found in some occasions that the security admin SQL Server role is also required on the SQL Server level to use this connection. I'm not 100% sure why that is, but it seems to fix a lot of problems like that when you get permission errors connecting to your SQL Server. The next adapter, this is at the other end, and this is the most restrictive out of all the adapters. It's called the local connection, and you're not going to see it here because by chance I do not have Content Matrix console installed on web front end directly. When you install the Content Matrix console on a web front end, sometimes the source, but typically the target, you can connect using a local connection. Now, the local connection, as I mentioned, is the most restrictive and requires specifically SQL Server permissions to be set correctly. And I have an example here in SQL Management Studio. That's my account right there. Just to show you quickly. Right-click, go Properties, go to User Mappings, and this will give you a list of the databases to which I have access. This can take them a while to come up. I don't know why it's taking so long. This machine seems very slow today. But what you need is the migration account, which may or may not be different from the account that's actually logged in to the Windows machine. The migration account that you specify here in the SharePoint Logon Connect As properties needs to have, again, this has come out, it needs to have DB owner rights to the following 3 databases: the SharePoint admin database, the SharePoint config database, and also, so we've got the admin, the config, it's hung again, and the content database. I don't know why this is so slow, sorry about that. But just make sure that your migration account that you specified does have DB owner access to all these 3 databases in order to use the local connection. And there are valid reasons for wanting to use the local connection sometimes when you want to get around potential double hop issues or performance. There it is right there. I don't want to click on another one because it's going to hang again. But performance, when you go directly from the source to the target without having your content matrix installed on a separate machine, creating an additional network hop, you significantly increase performance of your migrations. We also have, as an option, probably the most preferred of all connections for migrating various things. That's the Metalogix Web Service extensions. This particular adapter is a little bit more forgiving. It actually uses elevated permissions from IIS Server, specifically the Web Application Pool ID, and all that's required for that, both for this and everything I'm saying here applies to this connection to the remote connection to SharePoint. Client-side object model 2013. The native web servers we don't really use much unless there's a only specific reason we can use it and nothing else for SharePoint 2010. But all these 3 require that you have, as a bare minimum, site collection administrator privileges to both your source and target site collections. And again, that refers to the actual migration account here, not necessarily the one you're logged into the machine as or even launched the application as. So people ask us about that a lot. And when we do, now ideally, we'd like you to have farm admin privilege. We'd like your migration account to be in the farm admin group, farm administrator group for both source and target SharePoint farms. If that's not possible, and this is, this happens quite commonly, you may have a consultant who doesn't have necessarily access to a temporary environment for which they're running a project. So site collection administrator is the bare minimum. The reason for that is certain SharePoint functions store components in the root of the site collection, things like workflows and master pages and some other things. And we need to access those when we're running the migrations, especially on the source where we just simply can't access them, especially if you have anything stored in the root with SharePoint Designer, any customized forms and things like that. Contribute's not enough, site owner is not enough. Even for 2007, 2010, and 2013, you need to be site collection administrator in order to migrate any content. And as I mentioned, permissions are one of the areas which give us some of the most frequent cases and challenges. But on the plus side, they're the area which give us the most useful erroring. Usually, if it's a permissions problem, Content Matrix or SharePoint will almost always tell you. Login failed for SQL Server. 401 unauthorized for this page, permissions accessing this folder, cannot connect the site, not authorized, things like that. The errors are pretty specific and pretty accurate, I would say, which is not always the case with some other areas. You kind of have to do a little more digging. And in the area of migrating things like such as managed metadata, taxonomy, and my sites. So here you have, so this is also a requirement. In addition to being in the farm administrators group, some people seem to think that's often enough, and it's not for migrating managed metadata. And this applies, I would say, more so to the target, but also it's good to have it on the source as well if you can get it. Make sure your account, in addition to being a farm admin, and ideally also full control of the web app, is in the administrators group. So highlight, don't click on it, but highlight the managed metadata service, go to the administrators tab here, button, and just add your name into the group there. Part 2 of migrating taxonomy, in addition to requiring the administrators group, you also need to have full control access to the term store. Like I said, it's pretty picky. So term store administrators here, make sure your name is also in that group there for the target and also source, ideally. The same applies to migrating my sites. We'd like you to be an administrator for also, or is it the user profile service here? Just highlight it and go to the administrators group. And again, these are not in here by default just because you're a farm admin. And on the note of connections, there was one other one I wanted to bring up, which is not really part of design, but this is just something we've noticed a number of times throughout our troubleshooting years here. On some occasions, it may seem like you have all the required permissions for both source and targets. You're in the farm admin group, you're site collection administrator group, for whatever reason, and this more so applies, but not necessarily always, but more so applies to accounts, to environments with claims authentication, usually 2013. And you try to connect and it gives you an unauthorized and you can't figure out why. One workaround that is very helpful in this situation is is to do a farm connection. Now, for example, here, you typed in SharePoint 2013B and it connected you to the farm. And underneath that farm, you see all your site collections. To get around this issue, what we would do is we would put in the farm account, but we'd put in the central admin URL complete with the port. I don't know if that's the port or not. I just made it up. But connecting to the farm, to the central admin URL with a port number and choosing farm, the connection could be either the local connection or the web service extensions. My local's not here for the reason stated. This is not a web front end. That usually gets around the problem. So you add it in there and you just click OK, and what appears is you'll have a separate connection here with your central admin URL, and it'll look the same as this. It'll list all your site collections. That's just something to keep in mind, and I mention it because it's something we've seen quite often, and it's a little strange. Those are really the basics I have for the permissions, bare minimum permissions for using Content Matrix. There's one last one which I want to mention, and this occurs during the installation, and it's during the installation of, just launch this again, WSPs, the farm solutions. Now, there's a number of farm solutions which you can install using our installer. The most common one, of course, is the MetaLogix web service extensions to which you connect. They're a farm solution. It gets deployed throughout all your web front ends via the single install, and it also causes an IIS reset on all your web front ends. The other one is the organizer application, and the other one is the license checker. Now, sometimes we have problems. We've seen problems installing the web service extensions. I don't know why this is taking so long. This is very unusual. Sorry about that. But what will happen is you'll run the installer. It'll complete pretty quickly, and you know it's a problem if the here it is here, the install Content Matrix SharePoint WSPs. I'm not going to actually install. I'm just going to show you what it looks like. But if you run the installer and it only completes in 10 seconds, and says complete successfully, what your next step should be is to go into your central admin and look under your solution management. What you should see is your WSP files here, your SharePoint for extensions. This one here, and there's one for shared right here for the same version. Now these are in a state of deployed, which is what we want, but in the scenario I just mentioned, you'll see them installed here, but they're not deployed. Okay, that could be why it's giving me grief. Okay, I'll fix that later. So basically the solutions got installed, but they're not deployed. I would say 99% of the time, this is a permissions related issue. Even if you're in the farm admin group, and seem to have the necessary SQL Server permissions, it can give you problems. One very quick way to validate that is to simply open a SharePoint PowerShell window. It's got to be SharePoint. It can't be the Windows one or the Metalogix one. It's got to be the SharePoint PowerShell management shell here. This is going to take a while to come up because it's just slow. But basically what happens is instead of showing you an actual prompt like mine will here, because I have the right permissions, immediately it'll tell you cannot access local farm or something along those lines. That is permissions. That's actually pretty significant because you cannot run any PowerShell commands, which is what our installer does anyway to install those WSPs. So at that point, we need to investigate the permissions more thoroughly. And again, this is usually a SQL Server permissions issue. You got to make sure you have the DB owner on your config, on your admin, and on your content databases. And when we run into this situation, we usually have to install the WSPs using PowerShell. We do the add SP solution and the install SP solution. If you do come across this problem, just call the customer care and open up a case. We will guide you through that. It's something we've done a number of times. So as I mentioned, just to briefly recap, we need proper permissions in Content Matrix for virtually every step of the way, right from the installation, making sure you have them, make sure you're logged in as administrator, you run as administrator, you set the application in the Windows folder to run as administrator, make sure that each connection type has its proper associated minimum permissions required. And again, standard default is you need minimum site collection administrator group to copy any site collections or any SharePoint content for that matter. And yes, as soon as those are all set properly, you eliminated a whole slew of factors. Anyway, thanks for joining. If you have any problems, first of all, if you're wanting to look at this more thoroughly, there's a lot of good information in our documentation, both online and within the application. But if you still have problems, as always, just call the customer care 202-609-9100, and we'll be happy to help out. All right, thanks for listening, and have a great day.